Every month, my husband sent money to his sister until the day I went to meet her. When I arrived, there was no sister at all, and that was the day my marriage began to unravel in ways I never imagined. I never thought I would be the kind of woman who tells her story like this, but betrayal has a way of forcing truth out of you, whether you are ready or not. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that for 11 years, I believed I was married to a decent man, a quiet man, a responsible man, the kind of husband people praised behind your back, saying, "You're lucky, he doesn't drink, he doesn't cheat, he sends money to his family every month, look how good he is." And I believed it, because belief is easier than suspicion, especially when you are building a life brick by brick and you are tired and you trust the person sleeping beside you every night. It started small, like most lies do. A casual mention one evening while we were clearing dinner plates. He said, "I need to send some money to my sister this month. She's struggling again." I nodded without looking up. Family struggles are normal, aren't they? And the next month he said the same thing, and the month after that. And after a year, it became routine, like rent, electricity, groceries, sister. Every single month, money left our account, and every single month I told myself, this is what good men do. They take care of their family. But slowly, the numbers grew. The amounts got larger, his explanations thinner, his tone sharper if I ever asked questions. "Don't interrogate me," he would say. "She raised me when my parents died. You wouldn't understand." And that sentence became the wall I was not allowed to cross, because who argues with devotion? Who questions sacrifice? So I stayed silent, even when I noticed we were cutting back, even when I delayed buying myself new clothes, even when I took extra freelance work to cover things he used to handle, because he would sigh and say, "Money's tight, my sister needs me right now." And I swallowed my resentment like women are taught to do. And then, one afternoon, something cracked. My friend casually asked me what my sister-in-law does for work, and I froze. Because in 11 years, I had never seen her, never spoken to her, never even heard her voice. I had no photos, no stories, no shared memories, just a name and a bank transfer. And suddenly, that felt strange. I laughed it off that day, but the thought followed me home, sat beside me on the couch, watched me cook dinner, stared at me from across the bed. And the next time he said, "I'm sending money to my sister," I asked, "Where does she live now?" And he answered too quickly, gave a city I had never heard him mention before, and my stomach tightened. But still, I said nothing, because silence had become my survival strategy, until the day my curiosity outweighed my fear, and I decided to surprise him. I told him I was visiting a client for work, I booked a ticket to that city, I packed light, my heart heavy, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I would arrive, meet a tired, struggling woman, hug her, feel ashamed for doubting my husband, and return home relieved. But when I arrived and stood outside the address he had given me, it wasn't an apartment. It wasn't even a house. It was an empty lot. Dust, weeds, broken bricks, and a rusted gate chained shut. I checked the address again, my hand shaking, my phone buzzing in my palm with his missed calls, because he had finally realized I was not where I said I would be. And in that moment, standing in front of nothing, I felt something inside me collapse, not explode, collapse, quietly, like a building condemned long ago. And I sat on my suitcase in the dirt, and I cried. Not loud, dramatic cries, but silent, choking ones, because I understood something terrible. I had been faithful, honest, transparent, and the man I married had been sending pieces of our life away every month to someone who did not exist, or worse, someone he did not want me to know existed. And as I sat there, memories rearranged themselves. His late-night calls, his guarded phone, his sudden anger, his insistence on privacy, the way he flinched whenever I asked about family gatherings. It all lined up like evidence in a courtroom, and I realized I was not uncovering one lie, I was uncovering a system of lies, carefully maintained over years. And the worst part was not the money, not even the deception. It was the understanding that he had looked at me every day, knowing I was living in a story he had written without my consent. And when he finally called again, I answered, my voice steady despite the storm inside me, and I said calmly, "I'm at your sister's address. There is nothing here." And the silence on the other end was longer than any argument we had ever had. And in that silence, I knew the truth was coming, not as an apology, not as regret, but as a justification, because men who lie for years do not suddenly become honest, they become defensive. And that was the moment my marriage crossed a line it could never uncross. Because whatever he was about to say, whatever name he was about to give, whatever excuse he was about to invent, I knew I would never again be the woman who blindly trusted the man she loved. And that realization hurt more than any betrayal. Because innocence, once lost, never returns. And I stayed sitting there, listening to my own breathing, waiting for him to speak, knowing that when he did, when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. And that was when I knew this was not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but a practiced lie. He said, "You're mistaken. You must have gone to the old address. My sister moved years ago." And I almost laughed because the lie was so weak compared to the years it had carried itself with confidence. And I told him, "Don't do that. Don't insult me now. Just tell me the truth." And there was another pause, heavier this time. And then his tone changed. Not apologetic, not scared, but irritated, as if I had disrupted a system that worked fine for him. He said, "Why did you go there? I told you it was family business." And in that moment, something in me hardened, because I realized he was more angry about being caught than about hurting me. And I told him calmly, "I am your wife. Your family is my family." Or so I thought. And then he sighed, like a man tired of pretending, and said, "Fine, you want to know the truth? I'll tell you. But not over the phone. Come home and we'll talk." And I almost agreed, out of habit, out of years of choosing peace over answers. But then I remembered the empty lot, the dust on my shoes, the way my hands shook. And I said, "No, you're going to tell me now. Because if I get on that plane without knowing, I might not come back." And that startled him, because for the first time, he heard something he hadn't expected: strength. And after a long exhale, he said, "She isn't exactly my sister." And that sentence felt like the floor disappearing beneath me. I asked, "Then who is she?" And he said, "Someone I owe, someone who helped me when no one else did, someone I can't abandon." And I asked, "Helped you how?" And he said, "You wouldn't understand." And I said, "Try me, because you've been spending our money, our future, our security on her for years." And then he said something that changed everything. He said, "She has my child." And the world went silent. Not dramatic, not spinning, just empty, like all sound had been sucked out. And I realized the truth was far worse than I had imagined. This wasn't charity. This wasn't guilt. This was a second life. And as the pieces clicked together, I understood why there were no photos, no visits, no family gatherings, because you cannot merge two worlds built on lies. And I asked, "How old?" And he hesitated before saying, 10. And I sat there numb, doing the math, realizing that child was born 2 years into our marriage, while I was miscarrying, while I was blaming my body, while he was sending money and affection elsewhere. And when I asked why he didn't leave me, he said, "Because I loved you." And I laughed then, a hollow, broken sound, because love does not look like this. Love does not secretly create another family while letting your wife believe she is building one alone. And then he said the words that sealed his fate. He said, "I thought I could handle both." And that sentence showed me exactly who he was. A man who saw people as responsibilities, not humans with hearts. And I told him, "I am not your responsibility. I am your wife, and you lost that right." And he begged, then switched tactics, blamed me, said you were always busy, always tired, always stressed. And I realized he was rewriting history to ease his conscience. And I ended the call, not screaming, not crying, just done. And I returned home days later, not as his partner, but as a woman gathering evidence quietly. Bank statements, dates, messages, timelines. Because grief can wait, but clarity cannot. And as I uncovered more, I learned the money trail led not to a struggling single mother, but to a comfortable apartment, a private school tuition, vacations, gifts. And I understood I had been funding a life I was deliberately excluded from. And when I confronted him again, he cried. Real tears this time. Not for me, but for the fear of losing control. And he promised to cut contact, promised counseling, promised change. But trust, once shattered, does not respond to promises. It responds to patterns. And his pattern was deception. And I told him I was filing for separation. And he looked shocked, because men like him believe consequences are optional. And as the process began, I discovered one final twist that turned my pain into resolve. The woman he called his child's mother was legally married too, and her husband believed the child was his. And in that moment, I saw how far the lie spread, how many lives were being quietly manipulated. And I made a decision. I would no longer be a silent character in someone else's story. And what I chose to do next would expose everything, not out of revenge, but out of truth. Because sometimes the only way to heal. I did not sleep that night or the next, because when you realize your life has been built on a foundation of lies, your mind does not rest. It replays everything, looking for the moment you should have known. And as I sat alone in the house that no longer felt like mine, I kept thinking about that child. An innocent 10-year-old unknowingly standing at the center of destruction created by adults who chose convenience over honesty. And I realized this was bigger than my marriage, bigger than my pain, because silence would only allow the lies to continue, and I had already been silent for too long. So I started, carefully, not recklessly, because truth without strategy can backfire. I consulted a lawyer, quietly, a woman who listened without judgment as I laid out bank statements, timelines, call logs, messages. And when she looked up at me and said, "You have more than enough," I felt something I hadn't felt in years: validation. And she explained my rights, my options, the financial abuse, the deception, the way marital assets had been diverted without consent. And I understood. This was not just betrayal, it was theft of time, money, and agency. And as proceedings began, my husband oscillated between anger and despair, some days accusing me of destroying the family, other days begging me to forgive him for the sake of appearances. And each time he spoke, I saw him more clearly, not as the man I loved, but as the man who believed he could control narratives. And then came the moment I had been dreading, the woman and her husband, because the truth does not stay contained forever. And when I reached out to her husband anonymously with documents, proof, timelines, I expected rage, denial, chaos. But what came back was a simple message. "Thank you. I knew something was wrong." And that sentence broke me, because it meant he too had been living in confusion, doubting himself, doubting his reality, while two people reassured him everything was fine. And when the truth surfaced publicly, it spread fast. Families, friends, workplaces, because secrets thrive in darkness, but collapse in light. My husband lost more than his marriage. He lost credibility, trust, respect, the carefully constructed image of the devoted man. And he blamed me for that too, saying, "You could have handled this privately." And I replied, "Some things cannot be handled privately when they've been happening publicly in secret for years." And the woman disappeared, moved cities, cut contact, and left behind wreckage. And as for the child, arrangements were made, legal truths established, and it was painful but necessary, because children deserve truth, even when it hurts. And as the divorce finalized, I stood in front of the mirror one morning and saw someone new, not stronger, not colder, just awake. And I realized the money, the lies, the years, they did not define me. My response did. I rebuilt slowly. Financially, emotionally, socially, I learned to trust my instincts again, to ask questions without apology, to walk away when something felt wrong. And people still ask me sometimes, "How did you not know?" And I answer, because trust is not stupidity, it is courage misplaced. And I do not regret loving fully. I regret ignoring my own voice. And if there's one thing I know now, it is this: betrayal does not break you, silence does. And the day I stood in front of an empty lot was the day I stopped being a supporting character in someone else's deception and became the author of my own truth. People think the story ends when the divorce papers are signed or when the liar is exposed, but that is only the end of the noise, not the end of the consequences. Because after the courtrooms emptied and the phone calls stopped and the house echoed with a quiet I was not used to, I learned that betrayal leaves fingerprints on every corner of your life, and cleaning them takes time, patience, and an honesty you were never taught to practice with yourself. The first weeks after everything became public, I was watched closely by everyone, some with sympathy, some with curiosity, some with thinly disguised judgment, as if I had somehow been part of the crime simply by being deceived. And I understood then how society is trained to look for fault in women, even when they are the ones betrayed. And that realization hurt almost as much as my husband's lies, because it showed me how lonely truth can be once you start speaking it. My ex tried one last time to control the narrative. He told people I was cold, ambitious, unforgiving, that I'd destroyed something that could have been managed quietly. But what he could never understand was that I did not destroy anything. I simply stopped protecting the lie that benefited him and cost me everything. And then came the final twist, the one I never expected. Months after the divorce, when I was finally beginning to breathe normally again, I received a call from his mother, a woman who had praised him endlessly, who had accepted the money he sent without ever asking where it came from. And she was crying, not performative crying, but broken, humiliated crying. And she told me she had just found out the truth, not from him, but from neighbors, gossip, documents, whispers. And she said, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." And in that moment, I realized something important. Lies do not just deceive victims. They rot entire families from the inside. And she asked me for forgiveness, as if I were the keeper of absolution. And I told her gently, "Forgiveness is not something you ask from the person who paid the highest price." And I hung up, feeling strangely lighter, because for the first time, I was not carrying someone else's emotional burden. And then another truth surfaced. The money he had been sending every month was not only for the child, it had been partially invested under someone else's name, a safety net, a backup life in case he ever needed to walk away clean. And when my lawyer uncovered that and secured my rightful share, I understood just how calculated everything had been. This was not weakness, this was planning. And that realization closed the last door of hope I didn't know was still open. And as time passed, I rebuilt. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deliberately. I learned what peace actually feels like when it is not borrowed from denial. I traveled alone, sat in cafes without checking my phone, learned to enjoy silence without fear. And people started telling me, "You look different," and they meant happier. But what they didn't know was that happiness was not the goal. Freedom was. And sometimes, late at night, I still think about the woman I was, the one who defended him to friends, who justified his behavior, who told herself love means patience and sacrifice. And I wish I could reach back and tell her, this patience without truth is self-abandonment, and sacrifice without respect is slow self-destruction. And if you are listening to this story wondering if you should ask questions, if you should follow that uneasy feeling in your chest, let me tell you this. The truth does not arrive gently. It arrives when you are ready to survive it. And the day I went looking for a sister who did not exist was the day I found myself. And I would choose that painful awakening again every single time. Because living in truth, even when it time has a strange way of revealing who you become after the storm passes, because survival is loud, but healing is quiet. And months after everyone else moved on to new gossip, new scandals, new distractions, I was still learning how to exist without bracing myself for the next lie. And that was when I understood the final lesson of all this. That betrayal does not end when the betrayer is gone. It ends when you stop negotiating with your own pain. I began noticing small things. First, how my shoulders no longer tightened when my phone rang, how I could check a bank statement without my heart racing, how I could sit with silence and not feel like something terrible was about to happen. And those moments felt almost suspicious at first, because peace can feel unfamiliar when chaos has been normalized. And then one evening, as I was sorting old papers, deciding what to keep and what to throw away, I found a card he had written years ago telling me I was his only family. And I read it without anger, without tears, just clarity, because I could finally see it for what it was. Not a lie exactly, but a performance written to keep me in place. And I let it go into the trash without ceremony. And that simple act felt like closing a door I had been holding open for someone who never intended to walk through, honestly. And people still sometimes reach out asking how I managed to move forward, asking for advice, asking what I would do differently. And I tell them this: I would listen sooner, I would ask harder questions, I would believe actions over explanations, and I would never again mistake endurance for love. Because love does not require you to disappear quietly so someone else can live comfortably. And I learned that loyalty without truth is just obedience wearing a prettier name. And the last time I saw my ex was in a public place, by coincidence. He looked older, smaller, uncertain, and he tried to smile like we were still part of the same story. And I nodded politely because indifference is not cruelty, it is closure. And as I walked away, I realized I no longer needed him to understand what he did. I no longer needed apologies, explanations, or accountability from someone who had avoided it his entire life, because the chapter was complete, and my story had moved on. And if there is an ending to all of this, it is not revenge or victory or dramatic justice. It is this: knowing that I trusted, I was betrayed, I survived, and I reclaimed myself. And that is enough. Because the truth, once faced, does not ruin you, it releases you. And that is how my story ends. Not with bitterness, not with regret, but with a quiet, steady certainty that I will never again hand my reality to someone who benefits from keeping me in the dark. And that certainty is the kind. Even after you think a story has ended, life has a way of adding a final echo, not to hurt you again, but to show you how far you have come. And it happened one ordinary afternoon when I was standing in line at a grocery store, staring at nothing in particular, feeling strangely content when I heard my name spoken softly behind me. And I turned, expecting nothing, and there he was. Not my ex, but someone from that past life, a mutual friend who had once sat at our dinner table, laughing, praising my marriage, telling me how lucky I was. And his eyes could not meet mine because guilt ages people faster than time. And he said, "I always wondered how you handled everything." And I realized in that moment how many people had known pieces of the truth, how many had sensed something was wrong and chose comfort over honesty. And instead of anger, I felt something close to pity, because carrying unspoken knowledge is its own punishment. And I told him calmly, I handled it by choosing myself. And that sentence felt like a summary of years of pain, growth, and awakening. And as I walked away, I understood that my healing was no longer fragile. It did not depend on distance or silence. It could exist even in the presence of reminders. And later that week, I received a letter forwarded from an old address, no return name, just an apology written carefully, without excuses, without requests, without manipulation. And I knew it was from him because the handwriting was familiar. And for a moment, I held it, wondering if this was the closure people always talk about. And then I realized something important. Closure does not come from someone finally understanding the damage they caused. It comes from you no longer needing them to. And I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and put it away. Not to reread, not to treasure, but to acknowledge that it existed and that it no longer had power over me. And life continued in its quiet, unremarkable way. Mornings, coffee, work, laughter, small plans, and one day, without warning, I caught myself imagining a future without fear, a future where love would not require vigilance, where trust would not feel like a gamble. And that was when I knew I was truly free, because the past was no longer dictating the shape of my hope. And if someone listening to this is still in the middle of their own unraveling, still questioning their instincts, still wondering if they are overreacting, let me say this clearly. Doubt planted by someone else's deception is not intuition failing, it is intuition being ignored. And you do not need proof to deserve peace. You do not need permission to ask questions, and you do not need to stay loyal to a story that is costing you your sanity. And the final truth of my story is not about money sent every month or a sister who never existed. It is about the moment a woman stops explaining away her own discomfort and starts honoring it. Because that moment, no matter how painful, is the moment everything changes. And from that day forward, every choice I made, every boundary I held, every silence I refused was an act of self-respect. And that is the ending that matters, the one where the strangest thing about the end of a long deception is that it does not arrive with drama. It arrives with clarity. And clarity is quiet. It does not shout. It does not demand applause. It simply settles in your bones and refuses to leave. And that was how my life finally felt. Settled. Not perfect, not magically healed, but honest. And honesty brings a kind of calm that chaos never allows. And as the years moved forward, I stopped being known as the woman whose husband sent money to a sister who didn't exist, and became known simply as myself, a woman who rebuilt a life from truth instead of illusion. And sometimes when people hear my story, they expect rage, bitterness, a hardened heart. But what they don't understand is that anger is exhausting, and I was tired in a way that only long-term betrayal can make you tired. So I chose something else. I chose dignity. I chose to let the truth stand without decoration, without exaggeration, without apology, because the facts alone were enough. And with time, I learned that betrayal teaches you things happiness never will. It teaches you discernment, boundaries, the difference between privacy and secrecy, between patience and self-betrayal. And the most important lesson of all, that love without honesty is not love. It is control wrapped in familiarity. And I learned to trust myself again. Not blindly, but bravely. I learned that my instincts had always been right. They had just been drowned out by excuses I accepted too easily. And one day, sitting alone, watching the light change through my window, I realized something that felt like closure. I no longer needed this story to warn me because it no longer defined me. It had done its work. It had broken me open, taught me strength, and then stepped aside. And if someone, somewhere, is listening to this, still sending money, still accepting explanations that never quite add up, still telling themselves it's probably nothing, let my ending be your permission to look closer. Not with fear, but with courage. Because the truth does not punish you. It frees you. And the lie only survives as long as you protect it. And I stopped protecting it. And in doing so, I saved myself. And that is where my story truly ends. Not in loss, not in revenge, but in the quiet, powerful certainty that I will never again abandon myself for the comfort of someone else's deception. And that certainty is the kind of ending no one can take from you, no matter how carefully they lie.